Hey guys, welcome back to Fugazi Research Society. This episode is going to be a little bit off the beaten path. My sister and I are consumers of trash TV. We enjoy soulless, disgusting TLC programming. We were watching an episode of 1,000 Pound Sisters and stumbled on the topic of today's episode. For those of you who are fans of 1,000 Pound Sisters like us, you might be familiar with a place called Waverly Hills. Amy Slaton, one of the main characters, explains how it's a haunted insane asylum where she wants her and her fiance Brian to get married at or on Halloween. But because of its haunted reputation, her family refuses to attend because, and I quote, they don't want to bring back the demons with them. The whole thing's pretty white trash and honestly wonderful, but we've never heard of this place before. So I decided to check it out, and what I found was pretty incredible. It's a beautiful, very impressive building located in Louisville, Kentucky. It actually never was an insane asylum. It was an old tuberculosis hospital, or sanatorium, that was opened in 1926. Today it claims to be one of the most haunted places in America. But what if I were to tell you there's a deeper, more fascinating history to this place? What if we're not being told the real history? I'd like to offer a different perspective in examining this building and its history through an alternative lens. I know some of the things we're about to tell you might sound radical or unbelievable, especially if this is your first time hearing about it. But I encourage you to keep an open mind and be willing to consider the evidence and do your own research and then decide for yourself. On a quick side note, if you're new to the idea of Tartaria or the old world, there are so many incredible YouTube channels that cover the research of this topic. In our opinion, the best is Mine Unveiled. They have a Tartaria playlist that will teach you everything you need to know. Some of the other great channels worth checking out are My Lunch Break, Old World Exploration, John Levi, and Jared Boosters. We're also going to start a series where we break down all these ideas and conspiracies for beginners, so stay tuned for those episodes. Now, before we begin, it's important that we first understand what sanatoriums were and see if the mainstream history can explain why there's a need to build them, especially the ones as massive, impressive, and ornate as Waverly Hills. Alright, to understand sanatoriums, you first have to understand tuberculosis and what was going on in the late 1800s and early 1900s. According to mainstream history, tuberculosis is one of the oldest infectious diseases known to mankind. So it's always been a problem, but it reached epidemic proportions around 1880 to 1920. In direct response to tuberculosis, there was a sanatorium movement in the United States. A sanatorium is a medical facility designed specifically for long-term treatment of chronic diseases, but mostly they were for tuberculosis specifically. They were usually located in rural or mountainous areas, away from towns, with access to clean, pure air, sunlight, with a focus on rest, nutrition, and clean living. Patients often stay there for months, often years. Think of it as a part hospital, part retreat, with porches, open-air pavilions, and strict regimens. The idea was to admit patients in the early stages and build up their bodies up so they could overcome the disease and regain their health, all in a regulated institutional setting, which is wild to me that you could just be living your life and some doctor comes by and says, bang, you have tuberculosis, you're coming to this retreat and take your family with you and you're going to be here for a while. It's just, we'll get to more of that stuff later, but it's just still wild to me to think that this shit was going on, especially with us just coming out of COVID and the wild shit we did during COVID. But anyway, according to the book by Lynn Pohl entitled Waverly Hills Sanatorium, A History, there were 34 sanatoriums in the United States in 1900 with 4,485 beds. By 1925, there were 536 sanatoriums in the United States with a bed capacity of 673,338. That's about 500 new sanatoriums in the span of 25 years, or roughly 20 sanatoriums a year. And you guessed it, they all look like this. Just beautiful, extravagant masterpieces of architecture. It's just truly mind-boggling when you really look at it. So, I'll first present to you the story that the mainstream history likes to give us. A cute little wrapped up story, hoping that we won't look anything past the surface level. The land Waverly Hills was built on was purchased in 1883 by Major Thomas Hercules Hayes from a man named Will Adams. Hayes quickly encountered a problem. There were no schools close by for his daughters. Hayes had seen a small building at the bottom of the Adams property, so he asked if he could use it as a schoolhouse. Adams agrees. He has a few children himself, so his kids, Hayes' 7 daughters, technically he has 8, but only 7 would be school age at this time, and a few other nearby kids are all going to use this as a schoolhouse. Hayes then hires a school teacher named Lizzie Lee Harris, who comes to live with them. She loves the Walter Scott Waverly novels and names the schoolhouse Waverly Hills. Hayes loves the name so much that he named the entire property Waverly Hills. And the Board of Tuberculosis Hospitals must have loved the name too, since they kept it when they bought it from Hayes in 1908. My first thought was Hayes must be pretty rich just to hire a school teacher and start his own school. I decided to look into him a little bit more, and I think his background offers a few pieces to the puzzle. He lived from 1837 to 1909, so he probably would have been 46 years old when he bought the Waverly Hills land. He was married twice, first to Sarah Helm in 1861, and had two daughters. Some sources say 3, but we're just going to say 2 for now. And then to Georgia Broughton in 1869, where he had 6 more daughters. This guy is a baby maker. So let's pause and focus on his first marriage to Sarah Helm for a moment. Sarah's dad, so his father-in-law, was a General John Helm. John Helm was a huge deal in Kentucky. He was a lawyer, 2-time governor of the state, and president of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and best of all, a prominent Freemason, actually serving as a master of the lodge in Morris Lodge number 76 in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. So that's kind of a big deal there, being a master mason. There was an article written in 1910 about Hayes in the Confederate Veteran magazine, a little bit a year after he died, that sheds more light onto who Hayes was and his close relationship with his father-in-law, John Helm. It talks about how Helm acted as a mentor to Hayes and even prepared him for college. Hayes goes on to serve in the Civil War as Confederate, where he becomes a major. After the war, Hayes does not go back to practicing law. Instead, he focuses on farming his huge piece of land, and in 1883, he buys the land that would become Waverly Hills. In his later years, he gets into politics and serves 2 terms as a Kentucky state senator. He then gets involved with the railroad. I'm sure that all this is through his father-in-law, and then he becomes a prominent railroad developer. The reason this is important because it follows a pattern. If you're familiar with Tartaria, you'll notice that all the railroad guys and Freemasons are the ones who were in charge of claiming all these beautiful old world buildings and land and repurposing them and making them to look like our civilization built them. Could it be possible that Waverly Hills Sanatorium is older than we're being told? Could it have been there when Hayes originally bought the property? It wasn't built from scratch, but rather repurposed and modified to be a tuberculosis hospital. I know it might sound crazy to some of you that are not familiar with this theory already, but please keep an open mind because a lot of what we're being told isn't adding up. Now, before we get into the questionable construction timeline of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, I first want to show you what is happening in Louisville in 1883, the exact same year Hayes buys the Waverly Hills property. In 1883, Louisville was hosting the Southern Exposition. It was a World's Fair style industrial and technological show that was held annually for 100 days from 1883 to 1887. Now, if you're new to the idea of Tartaria, and what I mean by Tartaria, I just mean whatever old world civilization that was here prior to us, the best place to start, in my opinion, is the World's Fairs. There's an excellent book written by, this is not a joke, Howdy Mikowski, that discuss this topic in detail, and I encourage you guys to read that if you want to research further. Like the regular World's Fair, the Southern Exposition claimed that all the buildings on the 45-acre venue were built exclusively for the fair, and that's it. They were torn down right after. An interesting point to note is how they were allegedly temporary structures, but they're sturdy enough to last 5 years and be safe for millions of people to walk through and look at and touch. This fair was such a big deal that even the president himself, Chester Arthur, came to the opening inauguration ceremony. They claimed up to 1 million people attended the first year, with a total of 2.3 million people throughout the 5 years. The population of Louisville at this time was around 156,000. How did they promote it? Where was the infrastructure for all those people to stay during that time? If you have a town like Louisville that is just built for 156,000 people, some of it's just not adding up. But just some of the features, there's a 500,000 square foot wooden building that pictured here that doesn't look too wooden to me. 4,600 incandescent light bulbs, which was more lights than New York City at that time. And what powered that? And then 45 acres of open air expositions, gardens, and pavilions. It exhibited machinery, an art gallery, a model of a working farm, horticultural displays, concerts, fireworks, and even a miniature Mayan temple. It's just pretty wild that, number one, they had the resources to put this on. They had the motivation from people to put this on. Still just not adding up to me. But construction began in early 1883, January or February, and it was ready for opening day on August 1st, 1883, meaning that they built all of this in 6 to 7 months. In my opinion, all of these buildings were already here. And if this is what existed in Louisville in 1883 at the time, it's not that far-fetched to think that similar buildings, cough, cough, like the one that was 6 miles outside of town, Waverly Hills, wasn't already built there and just taken over and repurposed. Alright, so let's talk about the construction of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Mainstream history tells us construction began in 1924 on the main sanatorium we see today. There were various other small buildings that were used as the sanatorium prior, which we'll get into a little bit later. While construction dates vary from source to source, I'm going to use the date cited in Pohl's book of May 12, 1924. The building was finished in September 1926, with a formal dedication ceremony being held on October 20th, 1926. So there it is right there. That is a 28-month construction timeline. And of course, we're not given any pictures of the sanatorium being built. The only thing we get is an aerial shot of the hospital once it's done in 1926. Cameras were very common in the 1920s. You'd think that the construction of the latest and greatest state-of-the-art hospital, one that cost a little over $1 million, which is $17 million in today's money, would have had its construction process documented and photographed like every step of the way. There are also no official blueprints, but they give us many excuses. One of the excuses is the flood of 1937 that wiped out all the documents that were stored downtown. Also, many documents and records were destroyed when the hospital was shut down in 1961. We do have some designs that are blueprint-like, which we'll examine further in a moment. The building completed in 1926 was a 180,000 square foot, 5-story Gothic revival building made of brick and reinforced concrete. They boasted it was fireproof, modern, and made to last. Let's take a look at what they were able to build in 28 short months. The sanatorium had an impressive arched entryway, arched windows, complete with towers and a solarium. They even had time to hand-carve gargoyles to adorn the castle. Cough, cough, I mean hospital. The facility had its own power plant, water purification system, its own farm, its own zip code and post office, as well as a 500-foot underground tunnel with its own electric railcart system, which we'll dig into further in a moment. Waverly Hills is pretty much a self-contained little city. all built within 28 months. Okay, so now let's dive into the construction timeline and begin questioning the narrative that we're told. So number one, in the height of the Art Deco movement, why would they choose to build a Gothic revival building? Why would they build an impressive castle-like building for the poorest of the poor TB patients? Number two, the next interesting thing to consider is the location. This sanatorium is situated on the top of a wooded ridge with no paved roads at that time. It's 6 miles outside of town, and the only path up is a long, windy, muddy road. This would make construction and transport of materials extremely difficult at the time of construction. Number three, next, how did they find enough people to help build it in 28 months? A project of this sort would require hundreds of skilled workers at the time when the entire population was allegedly devastated by the TB epidemic. Even if you did find the workers, weren't they afraid of being near sick patients and catching tuberculosis themselves? At the time of construction, they said that they had the TB patients camped out next to the construction site. There was also a shortage of skilled construction workers at the time thanks to World War I casualties, the aftermath of the 1918 flu pandemic, regional labor shortages, the post-war construction boom, increased competition for limited skilled workers. Also, where did these hundreds of men sleep and eat? Did they commute to work every day? Number four. Next, think about the sheer quantity of building materials needed to build such a massive, impressive building. Just rough estimates would call for nearly 1 million bricks, 18 to 20 million pounds of concrete, 400 tons of steel rebar, 250,000 boards of lumber, 15,000 square feet of glass for the 2,000 plus windows, 25,000 square feet of roofing, 15,000 square feet of ceramic tile, 100 miles of electrical wiring, and the list goes on and on. First, you have to find a place to source this from. It takes time to fulfill an order, and then it has to be transported up the windy, long road. Did they have big trucks, or were they using a bunch of horse and buggies? Not to mention what it took to furnish the inside of the 400 beds. Linens, medical equipment, and supplies. It's really mind-boggling when you really sit down and think about it. And then, under the 28-month deadline, it becomes laughable. Number five. Now think about all the tools they had available at this time. By the 1920s, you would have had some electrical power tools introduced, but they're still heavy, unreliable, and tethered to a power source. What could power these tools? There were no modern cranes, there were no concrete trucks, no mobile mixers, no GPS leveling, no CAD-based architecture, no prefab components. This would have made tasks like lifting a 20-ton steel beam, pouring and leveling 5 stories of concrete, installing massive glass solarium windows, or sculpting gargoyles extremely time-consuming and difficult. The concrete had to be mixed on site and moved with wheelbarrows, pulleys, and hoists, which leads me to my next area of confusion: weather. Number 6. Kentucky has pretty extreme weather. It's pretty hot in the summertime and freezes in the wintertime. I looked up the temperatures for the years of 1924 and 1925, and let's just look at 1925 together. There was a high of 103 in the summer, and it got down to -4 in the winter. Concrete cannot be cured properly at temperatures that low, and mortar also cannot set properly when it's that cold. That means that there would have been 4 to 6 months cut off the top of the 28-month deadline, where concrete work would have had to be limited or completely stopped. Also, not to mention the dangerous muddy conditions that rain and snow would have caused for these workers. Alright, so let's talk about the architects. The next interesting area to look is who designed Waverly Hills. They tell us that Arthur Loomis made the original design, and then the firm D.X. Murphy was brought in to assist in both the design and the construction. We need to go on a little detour to tell you about these guys because it's crazy. The firm D.X. Murphy deserves its own episode, but basically they were a prominent architectural firm in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In fact, they're still around today, but under a new name, Lucky and Ferret. The firm actually goes all the way back to 1853 when it was being ran by Henry Whitestone, but we'll just look at the time when D.X. Murphy was running the joint. History tells us that little Dennis Xavier Murphy immigrates from Ireland and becomes a draftsman at the age of 16 for Henry Whitestone. By the age of 21, he's the head draftsman, and by the age 27, he becomes the owner when Whitestone retires. His brothers even come to go work for him, and he renames it D.X. Murphy and Brother. They become the talk of the town, designing many of Louisville's Catholic churches and other notable buildings. One interesting note is that they would work for a significantly reduced fee on the order of 1% of the construction costs. The reason we're given, they had a sister who was a nun who likely gave them all the commissions. They had a mini monopoly in constructing grand and ornate buildings in Louisville. This sounds like another cover-up origin story to me. And their supposed work is insanely beautiful. I'll show you a few examples. They're known for designing the twin spires at Churchill Downs for the Kentucky Derby, the St. Vincent de Paul Church, the Louisville Free Public Library, the German Bank Building, the Louisville City Hospital, among so many more. And he was able to pump out all these buildings flawlessly in about a year. Waverly Hills would have been one of Murphy's last buildings he took on at the ripe age of 71 years old. This career seems totally sus to me, and I personally think he was chosen to be the name they strapped on the construction fairy tale of Louisville. Arthur Loomis had the same story. He was a Freemason and a member of the Shriners, which meant you had to be the highest of the high Freemason invited into the club. Some of Loomis's greatest hits include the Conrad Caldwell House that's in the Old St. James Belgravia Historic District in Old Louisville, where the Southern Exposition was held, the Shelby Park Branch Library, Louisville Medical College, and the Whiteside Bakery Building, and the Jefferson Masonic Lodge, just as a few examples. And you guessed it again, he pumped these masterpieces out in a year or less. I also mentioned that we would talk about the blueprints we're provided with. It just doesn't seem to me like that they're original blueprints. It's more of a drawing, almost an inventory or exact diagram of an existing facility with their plans to repurpose or modify it. There's a date on the bottom that says 12/31/24, which would have been 6 months after the construction began. While it's not a smoking gun, I do find it interesting. Now, we do have the blueprints from the same company who is now under a different name. In 1962, when the building was again going to be repurposed into a geriatric care facility. If we saw the blueprints from 1962, does that mean that it was built in 1962? No. Just like how the blueprints from 1924 doesn't necessarily prove that it was built in 1924. The very last point we'll discuss regarding the construction timeline is this. I had mentioned earlier that there are several smaller buildings that have been built prior to the main sanatorium building in 1924, each of them impressive and beautiful in their own right. For example, this building here, construction started in 1908 and ended in 1910, 2 years. It's interesting that it took the same amount of time, essentially 2 years, to build this building and this building. The next interesting thing to discuss is the death chute. The explanation we get today is that it was built as a discreet way to dispose of all the dead bodies at Waverly without the rest of the patients seen. So let's take a deeper look at this death chute that was built with the rest of the sanatorium in 1926. We're told that the tunnel is about 500 feet, which is the size of 2.5 football fields or 2 city blocks. It starts at the lower levels of the main sanatorium building and goes down the entire hill at a 45-degree angle to stop in the front of the property. The engineering, grading, planning, and construction of this would have taken is overwhelming to think about. As you know, a pattern with these old world buildings is that there's an underground component. In my personal opinion, I think that there was way more tunnels under there than what we're told, and I think that it connects to other buildings and places in Louisville. There's so much more to look into, but I think that's enough for now. Just a fantastic, fascinating journey, and I'm starting to think that these sanatoriums were a continuation of perhaps the insane asylum movement. Maybe as time went on, it was more and more difficult to repurpose these old world buildings as insane asylums, so they had to pivot and start labeling them as sanatoriums, which was perfect because that seamlessly coincided with their new germ theory agenda. It's also interesting to note that many of these old world buildings get a reputation for being haunted. Could it be a tactic to keep people away so they really won't look into them? Or could it be that these old world buildings were built in certain places for a reason? Perhaps they were intentionally built on a ley line or other high energy places, not to mention what's under the building. Could it be quartz, which could explain some paranormal phenomena? This isn't the only old world building we will cover. There's a crazy amount of old world buildings in America and in every city. Go to your downtown, take a ride, look at these buildings with this newfound perspective and tell us what you think. Then look up the building's origins and you'll find crazy build times and fantastic cover-ups. I truly think founded means founded, not created or built. Thank you so much for joining in, and please consider liking and subscribing. It's going to take all of us questioning the narrative to understand our true history. I'd also like to love to read your guys' comments and learn what you think. As always, please remember, it's just a ride, and the only lesson is to love one another unconditionally with no strings attached. Until next time, guys.